Millions of pounds are being ploughed into the campaign against AIDS. In the battle against the disease, medical research has been almost exclusively devoted to defeating the now infamous HIV virus. But tonight's dispatch listens to the previously unheard voices of medical science, which say HIV is not the cause of AIDS. If the HIV theory is misguided, both research effort and money are being channeled away from the real cause of the disease, and the vilification of thousands of people who are HIV positive is not only unjust but cruelly wrong.
Steve John is HIV positive. He has antibodies to HIV, the so-called AIDS virus. He does not have AIDS, but he still suffers discrimination.
I've had a few friends who refuse to shake my hand anymore. I have a few close friends, or had a few close friends who refuse to kiss me anymore. I've suffered things where people refuse to share the same cup as me, or refuse to sit at the same table as me, or refuse... I had an incident once where some guy... had an apple, and I asked for a bite of it, and I presume this guy was a friend of mine. I took a bite from the apple, he took it out of my hand, and he threw it in the bin. You know, that stuff. It's all very little stuff, but it hurts. That stuff hurts.
The public have been encouraged to believe that AIDS is caused by a virus called HIV.
Well, Michael, the results of your blood tests have come through, and we have found antibodies that indicate that you are HIV positive.
Now, a growing number of scientists are challenging whether HIV has anything to do with AIDS.
I wouldn't mind 1 second to be antibody positive, to be told I'm antibody positive.
If this virus doesn't cause AIDS, then the vast research effort into HIV is tragically misdirected.
Tremendous amount of money is presently being spent on vaccines against the virus. And obviously, if the virus is not the causative agent of the disease, what good will the vaccine do?
Lots of money is available to study it and has been invested into it. And it has been, I think, big business, not only for basic research. It has become a political thing, and has also been a boost, I understand, for the press and for writers and for politicians.
Despite this uncertainty about the cause of AIDS, people looking into alternative theories are denied a voice.
Gradually, other clinicians are coming around and, if not agreeing, at least willing to listen. But at an official level, no one is interested, and in fact, we have been rejected outright, categorically, and at times rudely and impolitely.
It was in the homosexual areas of San Francisco that patients first started presenting with the opportunistic infections which are collectively known as the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Skin cancer, swollen lymph glands, a rare form of pneumonia. They started to die. These quilts were created as a massive memorial to the dead by friends and family. Young men were dying in increasing numbers, a painful reminder that money must be spent on research into what had come to be known as the gay plague. Within 2 years, an unusually short period for scientific research, a virus was declared the probable cause. In Paris, Cambridge, Maryland, and San Francisco, scientists isolated a virus now known as human immunodeficiency virus. The world was learning to live with AIDS while the gay community learned to bury their dead. The public were told a vaccine to protect against the disease would soon be found, and that the detection of antibodies to the virus would give prior warning of AIDS. Into this world, just beginning to come to terms with the crisis, Peter Duesberg dropped a depth charge. A professor of microbiology at the University of California at Berkeley, Duesberg is a world authority on viruses. He wrote a closely argued criticism of the theory that HIV causes AIDS in the leading journal Cancer Research. One of his arguments concerns the number of people who have AIDS but don't have the virus. A high number of AIDS patients have HIV antibody, but not all of them.
What's found in most AIDS patients is 80 to 90% of them have antibody to the virus. And these numbers come from those who believe in the viral hypothesis. But antibody to the virus doesn't mean the virus is there now on the virus. Certainly it means that the virus is not active at the time.
Paradoxically, the conventional test for AIDS is a test for the antibody mechanism which protects us from the disease. But what of a test for the virus itself? Is it easy to find in AIDS patients?
Free virus is never found in a patient, but what you can do is you can activate latent virus, dormant virus, in cell culture if you have an expensive setup designed to activate latent viruses. But it only works in, again, according to the same sources, 50% of AIDS patients which are antibody positive.
So while 80 to 90% of AIDS patients have antibody to HIV, the virus itself can only be cultured from the blood of half those tested, and then only in complex laboratory conditions. When looking for active virus, which is reproducing inside the body, the figure is even lower.
In only 10% of the AIDS patients, or those who are test antibody positive, has the genetic material, or the so-called virus, I introduce the word, being detected in their cells.
Dr. Stephen Chiesa, who deals with patients rather than laboratory experiments, also finds this surprising.
In fact, there are many known cases of AIDS without HIV infection. And when I say HIV infection, I mean we lack the ability to find HIV given any of our rather sophisticated technology. We can't find antibody, we can't find antigen, and we can't even culture the virus. Increasingly, we're recognizing that you certainly can have AIDS without HIV present.
Therefore, the first argument against HIV as the cause of AIDS is that there are AIDS patients with no virus. It was in Cambridge University that HIV was isolated from an AIDS patient for the second time. The work was done in the laboratory of the University Clinical School by Dr. Abraham Karpus. He firmly believes HIV causes AIDS. We put Peter Duesberg's points to him.
Practically all people who have developed AIDS or early symptoms of AIDS have detectable level of antibodies in their blood.
In how many AIDS patients is the virus recoverable?
It depends on the technology of the laboratory. Potentially, one should be able to recover it practically from every person who is infected. It should be possible to recover the virus.
We pointed out that, in fact, this doesn't always happen.
It doesn't always happen because, as I mentioned, it depends on the sensitivity of the test employed in a given laboratory, and also it's a very time-consuming business. So there is no real time, really, to spend several weeks to a month to look for a virus, while if you do tests for antibodies, you can tell within 2 hours whether the person is infected or not.
Another problem for those saying HIV is the cause of the disease is the number of people who have HIV antibodies, that is, they must have come into contact with the virus, but have not developed AIDS. In the United States, it is estimated that 1 to 2 million people are infected with the virus.
Of those, in a given year, 10 to 15,000 develop symptoms of AIDS, and about 5 to 6 or 7,000 die from AIDS. So that is less than 1% of those believed to be virus carrier develop the disease, and less than 0.5% die from AIDS.
John Beldeckers is a biochemical immunologist from Boston. He questions whether HIV is limited to high-risk groups. He and his colleagues have been testing the blood of newborn babies in Massachusetts for HIV positivity.
What they were looking for basically was just if there were antibodies or the frequency of antibodies to HIV in the reproductive population. And what they found was that in the inner city of Boston, the frequency was about 12 per 1,000 babies born, but that the seropositivity was throughout the whole state of Massachusetts. And that indicated to the researchers that it was throughout the state. It wasn't restricted to any one group. And what it says to me, and what it says to a lot of people, is that the virus is out there in a large in a large amount, and it's not restricted to the quote-unquote risk groups.
It shocked researchers that so many mothers and babies were antibody positive who didn't fall into any high-risk category. Simply put, if HIV causes AIDS, when there is a high level of HIV in the general population, there should be a correspondingly high level of AIDS.
To my knowledge, even though there are many babies positive for HIV in the state of Massachusetts, there really aren't many babies with AIDS. So there's a dichotomy right there. You know, how can you have a high frequency of virus and not show a lot of frank AIDS cases?
Thus, the second argument against HIV is the high number of people who have antibody but do not have the disease. Why isn't everyone with HIV positivity developing AIDS?
Or you can ask the same questions about any other infection. Fortunately, most of us have a very efficient immune system which develops antibodies to a given microorganism, including AIDS, and protect us from becoming ill.
The orthodox belief is that HIV infects the body and then lies dormant for several years before destroying the immune system. Duesberg finds this absurd.
It is dormant all the time. It never becomes active. It is dormant to begin with. It's dormant when you die from it. It's dormant when you suffer from it. There's no report in the literature describing the virus ever to be active in a patient, in a human being, only in cell culture. So it's always dormant. That is, in fact, one of the paradoxes of the viral hypothesis. There is no parasite that I know of among viruses and bacteria and fungus and anything that is dormant while it's pathogenic. This one is. That's one of the major reasons why I don't believe that this virus is the cause of AIDS.
The third challenge is that the virus is always inactive in carriers and AIDS patients and therefore cannot cause AIDS. In how many AIDS patients can the virus be shown actively to be replicating?
It depends on the stage of the illness of the given individual, but the fact that one can find the virus in the blood indicates that the virus is replicating actively.
The most complex part of Peter Duesberg's argument relates to the nature of HIV itself. He says it cannot cause a serious illness because it is a retrovirus. What is the difference between an ordinary and a retrovirus? Most common viruses, like flu and polio, penetrate a cell through its wall. Once inside, they use some of the structure of the cell to reproduce themselves. They reproduce in such quantity that they burst out. The virus particles are then released into the bloodstream to infect more cells or be destroyed by the body's immune system. A retrovirus, like HIV, will enter the cell in the same way as an ordinary virus. But because it is not capable of reproducing itself, it has to link into the cell's own genetic structure, the nucleus. When the cell subdivides by a process called mitosis, it reproduces itself exactly, including the retrovirus in its nucleus. So, unlike an ordinary virus, Duesberg argues that a retrovirus doesn't kill its host because it would destroy itself.
Retroviruses, unlike all other viruses, are not intrinsically lytic viruses or cell-killing viruses. In fact, they depend on mitosis, on dividing cells in order to replicate. So it's very difficult for a virus that depends on mitosis to replicate at the same time kill a cell. It would be hard to accomplish.
The fourth criticism of HIV is that it's not a type of virus that kills cells and causes serious illness. What does Dr. Karpus make of this criticism?
No, I don't agree with it. Peter Duesberg is a very distinguished molecular biologist, but I'm afraid he failed to understand the basic simplicity of straightforward cytolytic effect of a virus on a cell.
Dr. Dino Dinar directs medical research into AIDS at the Chiron Corporation in California. He supports the HIV theory despite its weaknesses.
I think that Professor Duesberg's arguments are well taken in some respects. it's quite clear that there are aspects to the pathogenesis of the disease that have not been explained, and therefore, from a semantic point of view, he's right in saying that we do not know that the virus causes the disease, since we don't know how the disease is caused. Nevertheless, transmission data and experimental data and statistical data, I think, show incontrovertibly that there is a direct association between infection with the HIV virus and AIDS development.
Is there a high level of HIV in AIDS patients?
In general, people have not been able to detect any substantial levels of virus, and that has been one of the most puzzling aspects of the viral infection itself. Reports would indicate that between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 100,000 cells in the peripheral blood of patients can be shown to be infected at any given time.
So there is a low level of HIV in the blood of AIDS patients. Despite Dr. Dinar's belief in the HIV theory, his work appears to support Duesberg's contention that there is never a high enough amount or titer of virus in an AIDS patient to cause an acute infection.
Well, that's exactly the point. There's not a high level of, in not one case has that ever been reported. There are thousands of papers in the literature on AIDS virus, in fact, probably 10,000 by now. Not one of them has ever reported the titer.
The final major argument is that levels of HIV in the blood of AIDS patients are too low to cause an acute infection.
He doesn't have any symptoms at all that you know of. Okay, well, in that case, he's probably perfectly healthy. He probably has the virus, and that's all.
It's easy to see the HIV dispute as an academic discussion about a laboratory artifact. Here at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, volunteers work night and day, calming the fears of a city which feels it is in the grip of a plague.
What do you have? What symptoms do you have?
AIDS Hotline, this is Mark.
AIDS Hotline.
A more political and emotional response to the crisis is given by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a properly formulated charity which helps people with AIDS and others in need.
Take a deep breath in right now. Breathe in deeply. Let it out slowly. Relax. Remember to keep breathing. You without rubbers, breathe anyway.
The sisters also promote gay rights and stage performances to lift the morale of a community under siege. Homosexuals were the first group identified as having acquired immune deficiency syndrome. They were classed as one of the 4 major risk groups, the so-called 4H club, of heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, Haitians, and homosexuals. All these groups are linked by a tendency to be immune suppressed regardless of HIV infection. Immune suppression is the basis of AIDS, which then allows fatal opportunistic infections to set in. One of the more enduring aspects of the 1967 Summer of Love is the extent of drug use in San Francisco. George Williams was an addict for 14 years. Now he goes out to the notorious Tenderloin district to give drug addicts information, contraceptives, and bleach. The bleach is to clean syringes where sharing is common practice.
Hang on. There you go. Hey, girl. Hey, baby.
Hard drugs themselves suppress the immune system, as do the many infections passed on by dirty needles.
Hey, baby, how you doing? You need bleach? Okay, here you go, Hank. Oh yeah, let me give you some bleach, too, man. You run out of bleach yet?
Yeah, I ain't got none.
Okay, here you go. Here you go.
Hemophiliacs need regular injections of factor VIII, which allows the blood to clot and which has to be extracted from blood plasma. Factor VIII has been shown to cause immune suppression as a side effect of its life-saving properties, so hemophiliacs can be immunosuppressed. Factor VIII is now heat-treated to remove any infectious agents, and it has never been possible to contract infection from donating blood or plasma. Others who may be immune-suppressed as a result of malnutrition and untreated infections are the Haitian victims, whose island had long been used as an erotic playground for tourists of every sexual persuasion. Numerically, homosexuals are still the major group to contract AIDS in the West. 84% of AIDS death in the United Kingdom are amongst homosexuals. The promiscuous lifestyle of some homosexuals is said to account for this.
People who are at risk, that we are constantly told about in order to keep up the AIDS panic, that's said now very frankly, are those who are exposed to many other things, like the highly promiscuous homosexuals and the intravenous drug users. And the risk is extrapolated from those to the rest of the community. This is essentially like assessing the risk for driving a car by studying Formula One drivers, race car drivers. They go at 300 miles an hour and in a car that looks very different from the Chevy that we drive across the bridge at 55.
There are alternatives to the HIV theory, but are they being heard? Someone who was researching into immunosuppression even before AIDS is Dr. Richard Ablin of the State University of New York. He has said that HIV may not be the cause of AIDS, but just a passenger on an already sinking ship. He believes damage to the immune system must come first. He thinks he has found a cause for this prior immune deficiency in a substance in both semen and factor VIII.
We've been continuing our studies with seminal plasma, in which we suggested that the oral and rectal deposition of semen was contributory to immunosuppression in individuals who subsequently went on to develop AIDS. And we've identified in seminal plasma, among several immunosuppressive substances, an enzyme which is called transglutaminase, which we feel we have some definitive evidence which shows that this enzyme contributes to immunosuppression. We wondered why people who, as I would call them perhaps as asymptomatic heterosexual hemophiliacs, had immune profiles that were almost identical to those in patients with, as some people call, full-blown AIDS. And what we found is that an enzyme which is present in seminal plasma is also present in the clotting factor, concentrates, sometimes referred to as factor VIII.
If transglutaminase is present in semen and can cause aberrations and problems, why aren't women infected by it? Why aren't more women getting AIDS?
This is a very good question. One of the problems here is that the lining of the rectum is much thinner than the lining of the vagina, and so that one could envision that the type of trauma that might be associated with anal intercourse would be much more severe than that which could occur with the vagina.
Further work on this theory, however, seems likely to move slowly because HIV research is soaking up all available funding.
There is not money that's really available to investigate alternative causes of AIDS. It says, we're told that it's available and people would tell you it's available, but when it actually comes to giving you the money and saying, you've presented us with evidence that you suggest that there's cofactors that are present and that you say that there's an enzyme in semen and there's an enzyme in clotting factor, and I'll present you with the data, but I doubt very much that if anybody will then turn around and say, here's some funds to investigate this.
Thank you for calling.
In a consulting room on Manhattan's Fifth Avenue, patients wait to see Dr. Stephen Chiesa. Although they've been diagnosed as having AIDS, they believe this doctor can cure them. Chiesa argues that the cause of AIDS is inadequately treated syphilis, and he treats his gay patients for just that, with large doses of antibiotics.
The connection between AIDS and syphilis is very intimate, probably causal. Bottom line, AIDS probably is syphilis. If that's not quite accurate, then certainly it is the case that in an HIV-infected individual, that is an individual with the so-called AIDS virus, if there is no syphilis, there will be no clinical disease.
So when was the last time that happened?
Oh, it's been a while now.
Dr. Chiesa says syphilis has been poorly treated in the past through the use of the wrong kind of penicillin, which did not kill off all the organisms which cause the disease. Some remained in the central nervous system. It is also his contention that many cases of syphilis have never been diagnosed and therefore never been treated, spreading the disease further in the susceptible gay population. If you say we've been inadequately treating syphilis for the last 40 years, why do you think that AIDS has appeared only within the last decade?
Probably because, as with all things in nature and in medicine, it requires a fair amount of time in order for problems to catch up with our mistakes. In addition to that, let's not forget that we may, I say may, well have a new virus that is now accelerating what would otherwise have been the natural course of a syphilitic infection. That is, I compare it to an accordion. Instead of an infection with syphilis running its natural course over 40 or 50 years, the virus may well accordionize that period of time into a few months or a few years.
Does HIV have a role to play in the disease at all?
It may be playing a facilitating role. HIV may well be playing an accelerating role. But in terms of a causal role, no, I do not believe that. Or else, why is it the case that increasingly we are recognizing HIV positive individuals who over a long period of time, specifically now up to 5, 7, 8 years, are doing remarkably well? The cause-effect relationship between HIV and AIDS has never been established.
Some sexually transmitted disease clinics are already investigating a possible link between so-called AIDS dementia and neurosyphilis. Dr. Chiesa cautions that he has only been treating his AIDS patients with antibiotics for 6 months.
After 6 months, clearly it's too soon, but of the patients I'm treating, and we're talking about between 50 and 75 patients, thus far, again, cross fingers, 100% of them are improved. Now, over time, no one bats 100%, but 6 months down the road, we haven't lost a patient. Not one patient has regressed, and in fact, all patients are better than when we began.
Chuck Ortleb, publisher of the New York Native, has always questioned the theory that HIV causes AIDS and has mounted a number of campaigns to attract public attention to alternative theories of the cause of the disease. Why is he not convinced when so many laboratories and scientists are?
I think if you started interviewing all of the scientists in those laboratories, you'd find out that there's a lot of doubt out there. They're afraid to speak up because they'll be punished. They will lose their grants. They will lose their jobs. Science in America at least AIDS science, is really religion. And if you dare challenge authority, you lose your livelihood. That's the way science works.
One of Chuck Ortleb's campaigns involved the possibility that AIDS could be a human variant of African swine fever. A paper was published in The Lancet noting a number of AIDS patients who appeared to be infected with African swine fever virus. Boston scientists Jane Teese and John Beldeckers carried out that research. How far did they pursue this apparent connection?
Well, I think the question should be rephrased as how far were we allowed to pursue this connection, and we weren't allowed to pursue it. There's a tremendous resistance here to pursue unorthodox scientific ideas, and even though we had good, solid proof in swine fever, it had been postulated as a possible agent in AIDS prior to HIV, so that they were beginning to work on it here. It was absolutely just excluded without any reason. They just thought it was a bad idea. They accused Dr. Teese of having wrong thinking. They accused me of being a lunatic fringe scientist, as in addition to being an out-of-the-closet homosexual. So that there was a political and a scientific agenda to prevent this going further. But that's not so unusual in view of the current political climate here in this country.
The American Defense Department has sufficient money to embark on an alternative line of research into AIDS here at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Dr. Shai-Ching Lo has published a paper on an unusual virus isolated from AIDS patients. HIV has never induced AIDS in a laboratory animal. Dr. Lo has managed to do this with his virus.
And it turns out that he has a virus that he isolated from AIDS patients, and he then infected monkeys with. The monkeys developed AIDS, or something that looks like AIDS, and died, and then he recovered the virus. So that seems to have shown that this agent can cause AIDS without HIV, because the monkeys were HIV negative.
One advantage of working for the Army is that Dr. Lowe is free from the prejudice surrounding US Department of Health research funding. Secrecy is the disadvantage. The military authorities would not allow us to make contact with Dr. Lowe. If the HIV theory is wrong, how could a mistake like this be made? How was HIV misidentified as the cause of AIDS? It is possible that sophisticated technology misled researchers to identify a harmless passenger virus as the cause of AIDS.
If you have an AIDS patient and you want to isolate the virus, you really have to go through a tremendous amount of unnatural laboratory steps to isolate the virus. Basically, what they do is take a lot of white blood cells, which presumably are infected, put them in culture, put them in a test tube, and bombard them with all types of chemicals, drugs, stimulators that in some way change those white cells and coax out the virus. Now, as a person growing viruses, I could take a cell from your body, from your neck, and under the appropriate laboratory conditions, I could coax out a lot of viruses that you in fact had been exposed to. A, that doesn't mean you are this walking carrier that's like, shedding viruses. And B, it doesn't mean that you are potentially infectious.
No one is suggesting that scientists deliberately set out to mislead. Merely that a retrovirus being identified as the cause of AIDS coincided remarkably with the availability of technology which could identify human retroviruses.
When you're in the retrovirus business, you can detect the retrovirus. Then you can say, okay, now here's a new disease. Let's look for retrovirus again. We have done that before with multiple sclerosis. We have done it with leukemias. We have done it with sarcomas. And in almost all cases, a virus was found sooner or later and then said to be the cause of the disease. What was not emphasized by many of these laboratories, and that's why this program is essentially a failure, that the same viruses were subsequently always found in healthy carriers.
Most of the researchers in AIDS came from the cancer research program, which had great success in isolating microorganisms, though little success in identifying them as the causes of cancer. The cost of this technology is high, but the financial rewards are commensurate. Here at the Chiron Corporation in California, work is proceeding on the development of a vaccine against HIV. What sort of money is involved in this enterprise?
I think one can safely say that it's a very large undertaking and definitely a multi-million-dollar development. In general, you could expect that a vaccine of this type would take anywhere between $20 to $30 million from inception to final approval, and perhaps more if it turns out to be more complicated than we expect.
Health and the drug industry have traditionally been areas for big investment and immense profitability. With the world in the grip of an AIDS panic, even drugs of admittedly limited effectiveness are making vast profits. If HIV isn't the cause of AIDS, huge sums are being misspent. Testing for the antibodies against HIV is a business so profitable that French and American scientists went to court to determine who owned the patent on the testing kit. Every time a drop of blood is tested in each one of the tiny wells in this tray, it means 43 pence for the company producing the kit.
In the context of the AIDS industry, that's how those who sell the tests and those who propagate the theory or advance the theory that the virus is the cause stay important and are able to sell their products. Many of those studying AIDS virus, AIDS researchers, have companies that sell test kits. And some of those, very well known to me, are worth millions of dollars, at least on paper, in stocks in those companies. So AIDS testing for them is a very profitable thing.
Another aspect of the focus on HIV as the cause of AIDS is the way research funding is being concentrated in few hands. Abraham Karpus, though he supports the HIV theory, had his application for government research funds rejected. He's had to go to the marketplace with a testing kit he developed in order to fund his research.
A Japanese company have bought a license to produce the test, and they're doing a very good job of it. And I hope that shortly they will engage the marketing companies that will distribute it worldwide. It is already being used in several countries.
What will happen to the profits derived from the sale of the testing kit?
Well, the profit, of course, the Japanese probably will get most of the profit, but I hope that a sizable percentage would come to the UK, namely to myself, and I will use it here to generate and help in the research work. I feel that AIDS, like several other things, have been monopolized by a group of individuals who call themselves scientists, and they try to make out of it as if it is the private domain, and anybody that doesn't belong to their circle finds it very difficult to get funding, and I think this is the main reason why I cannot get support for my research.
All this could be seen as just a storm in a test tube, of no interest to anyone outside the scientific community, except that merely having antibodies against a virus which may be just a passenger is seen as a social crime.
I know of people who have been living at home with their parents, and those parents have asked their son or their daughter who has HIV to leave, not to come back. We don't want to know you anymore. I know of people who have been asked to leave their jobs, and these are people who are well, who have no symptoms and who are no health risk to anybody else at all, still have been asked to leave their jobs. I know of people who have turned to statutory services for help with welfare, financial benefits. Two people went to their DHSS office to ask about benefits, and the next thing they heard was a knock on the door, and it was two policemen telling them to keep themselves to themselves.
In California, the fears that a panic over HIV could usher in a police state have already become a major political issue. The calm pleasures of one of the richest places in the world were disturbed in 1986 by Proposition 64, a referendum on the proposal to quarantine people who are HIV positive, even if they have no sign of AIDS. Backed by the LaRouche organization, widely regarded as right-wing extremists, the proposal attracted the support of 1 in 3 Californians. Brian Lands was one of the leaders of that campaign, which is continuing.
Under the initiative, any individual who tested positive for AIDS would not be allowed to work in or attend a public or private school in the state of California, nor would they be allowed to work in a commercial food handling establishment. We believe these are necessary steps, a precaution to be taken at this point, given the fact that we have 500,000 infected individuals at least in California at this time.
What happens if HIV positives will not change their lifestyle voluntarily?
If individuals do not change their lifestyle, if by that question you mean these individuals who have AIDS continue to engage in activities that would spread the disease, then those individuals should be quarantined.
Lands was at great pains to reject accusations of right-wing extremism.
I think that our opponents are the ones who are acting in a totally extremist fashion. We are proposing merely that existing public health law, as it applies to other communicable diseases, be applied to AIDS, so as to prevent the further spread of this deadly, deadly disease.
The Ray family in Arcadia, Florida, experienced attempts at containing AIDS when the 3 boys, HIV positive due to factor VIII taken for haemophilia, were thrown out of school. They suffered an arson attack on their home before a court order insisted they be allowed to go to school, but they needed a police guard. For Steve, a former drug addict, the stress of being HIV positive is profound.
I find it very difficult to talk to my friends and say, hey, look, I have HIV, and I feel like shit, usually, because being diagnosed HIV made me feel isolated, dirty, unwanted, unclean, not part of the human race no more. And why? Why is this?
People who test positive now are losing jobs or not entitled to get jobs, and many of them, I understand, go through serious depressions, in fact become suicidal because they're told they're going to die anyway in the next 4 or 5 years, no matter what they do. And that's one aspect of why I think AIDS testing is not so responsible or not so justified as it should be.
Even though the cause of AIDS is in doubt, the advice to prevent its spread is still appropriate. Drug addicts mustn't share needles. Sterile needles can't carry any infections. All people who have casual sex should use condoms, particularly homosexuals and drug addicts. These are preventive measures. How do we find the cause?
What we should really find out is what the true cause of AIDS is. And in order to do this, we have to work with the patient or go back to the clinic or back on the streets or in the bathhouses or study those who are at risk and see, in fact, what AIDS is. AIDS is not a disease entity. AIDS is a whole bag of old diseases under a new name.
For a virus that may not even cause a disease, I mean, it will make science look totally absurd. It could be a good thing in the long term because people will trust science less.